He had survived hostile takeovers, unforgiving boardrooms, and the suffocating silence of penthouses high above the world. But nothing in Adrian Cole's life had prepared him for a small boy walking up to him on a winter night and saying, "Don't cry, mister. You can borrow my mom." The words were simple, almost playful, yet they cut through the cold far more deeply than the snow collecting on his sleeves. They felt like a hand reaching into a room he had kept locked for years. It was the kind of evening where the city seemed to breathe differently. Snow drifted down in slow, thoughtful patterns, softening every sharp corner the world usually showed him. Lights glowed from the windows of nearby shops, casting warm reflections onto the pavement as people hurried past with gift bags and wrapped scarves. It should have been beautiful. For most people, it probably was. For Adrian, it only made the emptiness around him feel more defined. He sat alone on an iron bench beneath a street lamp whose glow seemed to struggle against the weight of winter. A paper cup rested beside him, once filled with hot coffee but now cold enough that no steam rose from it. He had not even taken a sip. He had bought it mostly so he would have something to hold, something to keep his hands occupied, something to convince himself that he still knew what warmth looked like. He could not remember the last time he felt connected to anyone. His days were shaped by schedules made for him, expectations pushed onto him, numbers that measured his achievements, but never once measured his loneliness. And there was a lot of loneliness, though he had become skilled at pretending otherwise. He inhaled slowly. The air was sharp enough to sting. He let it. Pain, at least, made him feel real. He had been 8 years old the last time tears had touched his face. It was a December night, years ago, in a temporary foster home that smelled faintly of antiseptic and worn-out blankets. He had waited for someone who never came, clinging to hope the way a small child clings to anything that might keep him warm. The memory was sealed somewhere deep inside him, but winter had a strange way of unlocking things. A soft rhythm of footsteps brushed across the snow. Adrian did not look up at first. People passed the bench often, but these steps slowed, paused, came closer. When he finally lifted his gaze, a pair of wide brown eyes met his. A little boy stood before him, bundled in a thick jacket with mittens that looked slightly too big for his hands. His cheeks were pink from the cold. His eyes, bright and observant, held none of the hesitation adults carried when approaching a stranger. Instead, they held clarity, as if the boy could see something in Adrian that even he no longer recognized. Behind him, a woman was handing a cookie to an older man seated near a tree. She spoke with a tone that carried warmth without effort, the kind of warmth people notice even when they are not the ones receiving it. She soon walked toward them, holding a tin wrapped in a red scarf. Before she could speak, the boy took one small step closer. "Mister," he said gently, "why are you sad?" The question startled Adrian more than he expected. Adults rarely saw past his name or status, and children seldom looked at him at all. He opened his mouth to respond, but the boy continued in a voice full of earnest concern. "Don't cry," he said, as if offering the most natural solution. "You can borrow my mom." The sentence seemed to hang in the air, soft and impossible all at once. Adrian blinked. Something in his chest shifted, almost painfully, like a door creaking open in a house long abandoned. Before he could find any words, the woman hurried the last few steps toward them. "I am so sorry," she said, though her voice carried more kindness than embarrassment. "Theo means well. He just speaks from the heart." Theo nodded proudly, as if confirming a remarkable ability. Mama makes everything better, he added. The woman, Mara Ellison, lifted the tin and opened it. The smell of warm spices spread gently between them. We are passing out cookies tonight, she explained. This one might be sweeter than necessary, a bit like Theo. Adrian accepted it carefully, as though it might break. The cookie was shaped like a star, slightly uneven at the edges, dusted with sugar that sparkled under the street lamp's glow. He thanked her, the words leaving him slowly, as if unsure how to form something so simple. Mara gave him a soft nod, then guided Theo along the path, continuing their quiet mission of handing out cookies to people who looked like they could use a gentle moment. Adrian watched them move from person to person, their presence bringing warmth the same way a lantern brings light into a dark room. He looked down at the star-shaped cookie in his hand. It was warm in a way that surprised him. Not hot, but warm enough that he imagined it had just left the oven moments ago. He held it for a long moment, feeling the gentle heat press into his glove. It struck him how long it had been since someone had offered him something without expecting anything back. When he finally took a bite, the sweetness hit him softly, like a memory from a time before life taught him how to survive by closing every door inside himself. Somewhere behind him, Theo laughed, a clear sound, bright enough to travel across the quiet park. Adrian lifted his gaze toward the winter sky. Snowflakes drifted downward, each one melting upon his coat. For the first time in longer than he could measure, the world felt slightly less heavy. He did not know yet that this small encounter would become the beginning of everything he thought he had lost. But the first spark had been lit, and even he could feel its faint glow warming the cold edges of his life. The snowfall had slowed by the time Adrian rose from the bench, brushing a thin layer of white from his coat. The cookie tin in Mara's hands was already half empty as she and Theo moved from one person to another, offering small pieces of sweetness to strangers who rarely received any. For reasons he could not explain, at least not yet, Adrian found himself taking a quiet step toward them. He cleared his throat gently. "Would you allow me to buy you both a hot drink? It's cold, and I imagine handing out kindness in this weather must take more energy than people realize." Mara turned toward him, her expression open but cautious, as if kindness was natural to her, but accepting it still required consideration. Theo, on the other hand, had already made the decision. "I want hot chocolate," the boy announced cheerfully. "Real hot chocolate. Not the pretend kind that tastes like warm water." Mara sighed in a way only a mother could. "Theo." But she was smiling, and Adrian found himself smiling too, the expression unfamiliar, as though it belonged to a version of him he had not met in years. "There's a little cafe just around that corner," Mara said. "Small place, but it's cozy." Cozy. It was a word he rarely used. His world was made of polished stone, glass offices, and a silence that echoed even when people were speaking to him. But he nodded, and the three of them walked together. The cafe sat between a small flower shop and a used bookstore. The sign above the door flickered slightly, not out of neglect, but out of age, like a light determined to keep glowing. When they stepped inside, warmth enveloped them immediately. Windows fogged around the edges, tables glowed under soft lamps, and the scent of cocoa and cloves drifted as gently as the music playing in the background. Theo rushed ahead to press his face to the glass display of pastries. "Mama, look, they have cinnamon rolls as big as my face." "We'll see," Mara answered, though amusement softened her voice. Adrian had expected her to let the barista handle the drinks, but instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos wrapped in a knitted sleeve. "I always bring extra," she explained when she noticed his surprise. "For Theo, and for anyone who might need a warm drink. It saves money and makes everything feel a little more thoughtful." She unscrewed the lid, and a thin wisp of chocolate-scented steam rose into the air. "It's still warm," she said, filling 2 cups from the thermos. Then, after only the slightest hesitation, she poured a third and handed it to Adrian. He held the cup carefully. The warmth pressed gently through his gloves. "Thank you," he murmured, and the words felt deeper than their simple sound. He lifted the cup to his lips and took a sip. It tasted like winter should taste, sweet enough to soften the cold, rich enough to feel like comfort. Mara watched him with a quiet curiosity. "You looked like someone who needed something warm." It amazed him how easily she could see through things he had spent years covering. "It has been..." He paused, then tried again. "It has been a very long time since someone poured something warm for me." She didn't respond with pity. She simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of the sentence, and that was somehow easier to accept. Theo returned from the pastry display with sparkling eyes. "Mama, can we tell him about our tree?" Mara raised an eyebrow. "Our tree is not very impressive." "It is too," Theo insisted. "It leans like it's thinking very hard." Adrian let out a soft breath that could have been laughter. "A thinking tree sounds impressive to me." Theo climbed onto the chair, legs swinging. "It's small and crooked, and the lights blink in a silly way because they're older than me." "That part is true," Mara admitted. "And we have these paper stars I made when I was little," Theo continued. "They're wonky, but Mama says they still count." Mara smiled at her son, then looked at Adrian. "Every tree counts," she said softly, "as long as someone looks at it with belief." He froze, not visibly, but inwardly, where old memories lived like shadows behind locked doors. A small Christmas tree in an office that no one visited. A childhood night where he had stared at an undecorated branch in a temporary home and wondered if it still counted as something if no one loved it. Her sentence reached that memory, touched it gently, and warmed it without forcing it open. "That's a beautiful thought," he said quietly. "It's not meant to be profound," Mara replied. "It's just that even small things deserve a little faith." He looked at her for a moment, realizing how unusual it was to meet someone who spoke sincerity without expecting anything in return. She had the kind of presence that made even simple truths feel like soft lanterns hung in dark spaces. Theo, meanwhile, had discovered a napkin and was busy drawing shapes on it with a crayon from his pocket. "Mama, look," he said, holding up the napkin. "It's us, and Mr. But I didn't know how to draw his hair." Mara leaned over. "Theo, he's sitting right here." Theo blinked, then looked up at Adrian. "Sorry, mister. Your hair is hard." Adrian chuckled. "I've been told that before." The boy went back to his drawing, adding stars around the figures, as if the world around them deserved a bit more light. Adrian took another sip of the hot chocolate. He hadn't realized how thirsty he was for something simple, something gentle, something human. The cafe's lights reflected softly in the windows, turning the world outside into a blur of snow and gold. For the first time in longer than he could measure, he felt his shoulders loosen, the tension he carried slowly melting like frost near a fire. He glanced at Mara, who was quietly watching Theo draw. He did not know what this meeting would become. He did not know that it would lead him back into a past he thought he had buried or into a future he never imagined possible. But he felt something subtle shifting inside him, a soft pulse, like the first sign of warmth returning to a place that had been cold for far too long. The night after their visit to the cafe, the city settled into a gentler quiet. Snow that had fallen earlier now rested in soft layers along windowsills and rooftops, turning the world into something that looked almost tender. In a small apartment on the third floor of an aging building, Mara Ellison sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by colored papers, half-finished props, and a loosely organized pile of her late mother's case files. She had been preparing the next set of materials for her children's theater project, the Lantern Kids, a group of children who had often been pushed to the edges of attention. Some were shy, some struggled to speak, some simply had never been told that their voices mattered. Working with them made Mara feel grounded, as if everything she had experienced, every difficulty, every quiet strength learned the hard way, could be turned into something useful. While searching for an old template her mother once used to organize performance notes, Mara pulled out a cardboard box from the back of her closet. The lid resisted at first, swollen slightly from age, but eventually gave way with a soft sigh of dust. The contents were familiar: old notebooks, faded envelopes, and case folders from the years when her mother had been a social worker. Mara reached for one near the bottom, drawn by a corner of worn red paper. The file was thin, almost fragile with time. Across the top, written in her mother's quiet handwriting, were the words, "Temporary Care, December 2001. Below it, typed neatly, was a name she had not thought about in years: Adrian Cole. Her breath caught as she opened the folder. Inside was a photograph of a boy, 8 years old, small, serious, with eyes that held a kind of watchful ache. He wore a red scarf wrapped several times around his neck, far too large for him, as if it had been the only thing in his life capable of giving warmth. Mara felt something stir in her memory. She remembered him. He had stayed with her family for 5 days during that cold December. She had been just a child then, but even children recognize certain truths long before adults name them. She remembered how quietly he moved through the house, how carefully he handled everything, as if afraid he might break something he had not meant to touch. She remembered that he never took the last slice of bread, never turned on a light without asking, never assumed anything was meant for him. And she remembered the crooked reindeer she had drawn on a scrap of paper late one night. Her drawing skills had been poor at the time. One antler had been longer than the other, and the body looked more like a potato than a deer. She had slipped the drawing under the door of the spare room, where he slept, hoping it might make him smile. The next morning, she had seen the paper neatly placed on top of his small suitcase, as if it had become something he needed to hold on to. She touched the edge of the photograph now, surprised at how the memory had softened with time. It was not simply the memory of him, but the memory of who she had been. A little girl who believed even a crooked reindeer might give someone comfort. Mara closed the folder gently, as though the past might crumble if handled too quickly. She sat quietly, letting the recognition wash over her. Adrian Cole, the man she and Theo had shared cocoa with in the cafe. The man who had looked as if he had forgotten what warmth felt like. The man her son had offered to share her with so freely. She knew she could not ignore the discovery, not because she expected anything from it, but because some truths wanted to be acknowledged, and this one had found its way back to her like a small light returning home. The next afternoon, she texted Adrian, asking if he might join her for coffee at a quiet bakery near her apartment. He agreed, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps because something in the night before had also shifted for him. When he arrived, carrying a gentle tension in his posture, she invited him to sit by the window where the light fell softly across the table. "I found something last night," she began, placing the thin folder on the table. "I thought you should see it." Adrian looked at the file but did not touch it. His eyes flickered with hesitation, as though he sensed the weight of whatever sat inside. Finally, he opened the folder and drew in a slow breath. The photograph stared back at him. The little boy with the red scarf, his own face from a time he rarely allowed himself to remember. A steady kind of quiet filled the space between them. "You stayed with my family once," Mara said softly. "5 days. My mother took care of you." He nodded, still looking at the image, his expression unreadable but deeply alive. "I remember your house. The walls were yellow, and there was a heater in the hallway that clicked at night. You were very quiet," she said. "I was always quiet," he replied. "Quiet was safer." Mara hesitated, then reached into the folder and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. When she unfolded it, the childish drawing of a reindeer appeared, uneven and imperfect, yet still carrying the earnest heart of a child who had tried to offer kindness. Adrian blinked, eyes softening. "You drew this. You kept it," she said. "For years," he admitted. "It was the only thing that made me feel like I wasn't invisible. You once told me that I deserved a Christmas. I never forgot that." Her voice gentled. "You did. You still do." For a moment, neither spoke. The bakery's soft music filled the silence. Outside, snow fluttered past the window like passing thoughts. Inside, a memory that had once belonged to two lonely children settled into the warmth of adulthood, reminding them both that kindness, no matter how small, was never wasted. Adrian closed the folder carefully, his fingers lingering on the reindeer drawing. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his expression. Not quite a smile, but something fuller than neutrality. Something that felt like rediscovery. "It seems," he said quietly, "that our lives crossed long before yesterday." "It seems so," Mara replied. And in that quiet bakery, lit by the afternoon sun, the past and present touched gently, weaving a thread neither of them had expected to find again. The weeks that followed moved gently at first, drifting like fresh snow that had not yet learned how heavy it could become. Mara spent her evenings preparing for the trial performance of her children's theater project, a modest show that gathered children who often hid behind their own quietness. She felt a soft pride watching them rehearse. Some had never spoken loudly in a classroom, yet here they were practicing lines, holding lantern props made of painted jars, and discovering that their small voices could glow. On the night of the trial show, the community center was far from full, but it felt alive. Parents, volunteers, and a few curious neighbors took their seats. The children, dressed in simple costumes, stood behind the curtain, shifting nervously, their excitement trembling through the fabric like a heartbeat. Mara knelt beside one boy, adjusting a cardboard moon taped to his shirt. Another girl clung to her sleeve, whispering that she was afraid of forgetting her line. Mara reassured them all with the same warm steadiness she had shown Theo 1,000 times. A soft hush settled over the room when the lights dimmed, and when the curtain finally opened, the stage glowed with the delicate courage of children who rarely had the chance to be seen. Theo stood near the back, holding a little lantern made of a jar wrapped in gold paper. His face shone with pride. When the curtain closed for the final time, applause filled the small room. Parents wiped tears, A volunteer hugged Mara. Even the man at the soundboard, who pretended not to care about anything sentimental, cleared his throat more times than necessary. Mara walked home that evening with her scarf trailing behind her, her heart full enough to warm the entire cold neighborhood. But morning has a way of changing things. The next day, Mara awoke to a notification on her phone. A friend had sent her a link with the words, "Have you seen this yet?" She opened it slowly, not because she expected something terrible, but because she had learned long ago that the world often delivers its harshest news without warning. The link led to a blog post. It was anonymous, written by someone who clearly understood how to make falsehoods appear convincing. The author accused her of stealing the structure and themes of her play from an obscure production nearly a decade old, twisting coincidences into deliberate choices and linking screenshots that, taken out of context, looked incriminating. At first, Mara simply stared at the screen. Her heart slowed, her breath shortened. The room around her seemed to tilt slightly. She read the post again, and then a third time, as if repetition might make it less sharp. Comments had already begun to gather beneath it. Some defended her. Many did not. By noon, the Bright Oak Foundation paused her funding, stating they needed to review the situation. One collaborator, Nora Wells, sent a brief message saying she could not associate her name with a project under public scrutiny. Another simply stopped responding altogether. Mara felt something inside her sink, not because she feared losing funding, but because she feared losing the trust of the children who had looked at her with such glowing hope the night before. She printed rehearsal sheets for them anyway. Her hands trembled faintly as she stacked the pages. The printer hummed steadily, unaware that each sheet seemed to weigh more than the last. She refused to cry. She had learned too early in life that crying rarely changed anything. Instead, she pressed her palms against the edge of the table until her breathing steadied. That afternoon, Theo visited Adrian at his office. He loved visiting there, mostly because Adrian would sneak him chocolate mints from a glass jar he kept near his desk. Today, though, Theo walked in quieter than usual. "Are you all right?" Adrian asked, kneeling slightly to meet his eyes. Theo shook his head. "People online are saying bad things about Mom's play." He looked down at his shoes. "But she didn't steal anything. She doesn't even let me take crayons from school unless I ask." The simplicity of the statement struck Adrian harder than any headline could have. He straightened slowly, his expression cooling with a kind of focused resolve he reserved for battles that mattered. "Is your mom at home now?" he asked gently. Theo nodded. "Then I think it is time we help her." Adrian picked up his phone and called his legal advisor, Daniel Shore, a man known for navigating complex accusations with a steadiness few possessed. Adrian explained the situation in calm but clipped words. Within minutes, Daniel was already gathering timestamps, original drafts, email chains, rehearsal notes, and all the small pieces that would dismantle the accusation once they were placed in clear order. The digital trail behind the anonymous post was traced more quickly than the author could have imagined. It led unmistakably to Evan Strickland, a former associate of the community center who had once argued over creative direction with Mara, someone who believed his work deserved more recognition than hers. Bitterness, when left unchecked, has a way of sharpening into cruelty. By evening, Adrian's office released a formal statement presenting the evidence. It was calm, factual, and steady, exactly the tone Mara herself would have used. Daniel filed a cease and desist letter, and Bright Oak Foundation restored the funding within hours, adding an apology and offering promotional support for the final performance. When Mara's phone rang that evening and she saw Adrian's name, she hesitated before answering. "Hello," she managed, her voice quieter than usual. "I wanted to let you know," he said gently, "that the situation has been handled." She closed her eyes, relief folding over her like a blanket she had forgotten she needed. "I am not used to being protected," she whispered. There was a brief silence, warm rather than awkward. "I used to say that too," Adrian replied. "But no one should get used to being alone." Her breath shook once, softly. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to lean back in her chair and feel the strength returning to her bones. Winter school days carried their own kind of heaviness, the kind that settled into hallways and drifted between classroom desks like a quiet fog. On the morning everything changed, Theo Ellison walked into his classroom with his usual bright energy, unaware that the day would deliver a wound sharper than the cold outside. His teacher, Ms. Carver, announced a simple assignment. Each child would draw a family tree and share something about the people they loved. Children began sketching branches, laughing and comparing drawings. Some added grandparents, some added cousins. Some filled the page with energetic scribbles. Theo drew himself and his mother, a small circle joined to a larger one, smiling beneath a star. When Ms. Carver asked if he wanted to add a father, Theo shook his head calmly. "I only have my mom," he said. Most children nodded, accepting the answer with the innocence of those who do not yet understand how to wound. But a few students at a nearby table whispered, then snickered. One boy leaned forward and said, "Maybe your mom just made you up." Another chimed in, louder, "Maybe your dad saw you and ran away." Someone else laughed, the sound sharp enough to sting. Theo felt his throat tighten. He tried to blink away the hurt, but tears blurred the drawing he had worked so carefully on. He didn't cry, not in front of them. But something in him felt small and exposed, like a lantern whose flame flickered uncertainly in the winter wind. When the bell rang, he walked out alone, clutching the family tree in trembling hands. At home that afternoon, Mara returned from a meeting, feeling tired but quietly relieved after the chaos of the past week. She unlocked their apartment door with the familiar twist of her wrist, expecting to hear Theo humming in the kitchen or scattering crayons across the living room floor. But the apartment was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the hollow kind that made every shadow feel wrong. Mara stepped inside, calling his name, softly at first, then louder. Theo's shoes were gone. His winter coat was missing from the hook. His favorite stuffed bear, which he always left on his bed when he went to school, now sat abandoned near the door, as if he had left in a hurry. Fear tightened instantly around her lungs. She checked the building hallway, knocked on neighbors' doors, walked down to the corner store where Theo sometimes browsed the candy aisle. Nothing. She searched the playground, the bus stop, and the small alley behind their building where stray cats liked to gather. Still nothing. Minutes stretched thin and sharp. Panic blurred the edges of her thoughts. Her breath shook as the sky dimmed toward evening. Finally, she did the one thing her heart pushed her to do. She called Adrian. When he answered, she didn't manage more than a trembling breath before words spilled out. "Adrian, I can't find him. Theo is gone." There was no hesitation in Adrian's response. "Tell me everywhere you have searched." She listed every street, corner, and hallway she had checked, her voice tightening each time she said the words, "not there." When she finished, he said gently but firmly, "I think I know where he is." He hung up only after making sure she was heading home to wait, promising he would bring Theo back to her. Adrian drove with a steady urgency, though his mind was no longer in the present. It was remembering another night, another bench, another child waiting for someone who never came. He felt the echo of that memory in his bones, and his hands tightened on the steering wheel with a determination that came from a place far deeper than logic. When he reached the park, snow had begun to fall again, drifting in soft flakes that glowed under the street lamps. And there, on the familiar bench where their story had begun, he saw a small figure curled into himself, arms wrapped around his knees, head bowed. Theo. Relief hit him so strongly he needed a moment to steady his breath. He approached quietly so as not to startle him. "Theo," he said gently. The boy looked up, eyes red from holding back tears. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and his mittens were soaked through. He tried to smile but couldn't quite manage it. "I came here," Theo whispered, "because this is where you and Mama found me before." He paused, voice trembling. "I wanted to see if someone still waited here, because maybe if I waited too, someone would come for me." The words pierced through Adrian with the force of recognition. This was the voice of a child who feared being left behind, a voice he had once carried himself. Adrian knelt beside him and wrapped his coat around the boy's small shoulders. "Theo," he said softly, "I am here, and your mother is looking everywhere for you. Let's go home." Theo leaned into him, shivering slightly, but his breathing soon steadied as warmth enveloped him. Adrian lifted him gently, the boy's arms holding tightly around his neck. As he walked back toward the car, he glanced at the bench one last time. Snow was settling on it again, silent and patient, as if guarding the memory of two children, one from years ago and one from today, who had both waited there for someone to return. When they reached the apartment, Mara was already at the door, her face pale with fear. The moment she saw them, she clapped a hand over her mouth and crumpled forward, gathering Theo into her arms as though she needed to feel every breath he took. "I was so scared," she whispered into his hair. Theo held her tightly. "I'm sorry, Mama." Adrian stepped back slightly, giving them space, but he could feel something shifting inside him. A question, or perhaps a realization, rose quietly within his chest. He had once been the child who waited in the cold. Now he was the one returning for a child who believed he might be forgotten. Theo turned in his mother's arms, looking up at Adrian with an honesty that could melt the hardest frost. "You came for me," he said softly. Adrian's voice carried no hesitation. "Always." The word lingered in the hallway like a promise, wrapping warmly around the three of them as snow continued to fall outside, steady and protective. The day after Theo's disappearance passed with a quiet tenderness, as if the world itself understood that hearts needed gentler handling. Mara kept Theo close, letting him help mix batter in the kitchen, letting him sit beside her while she prepared scripts for the children, letting him talk about anything he wished. She did not mention the family tree assignment. She didn't need to. The wound was still too fresh to name. Adrian visited later that afternoon, bringing a small bag of groceries and a soft greeting that filled the room without intruding. Theo ran to him with the kind of relief only children can fully express, hugging him before darting back to the table to stir a bowl of ingredients that no longer needed stirring. Mara met Adrian's eyes. Gratitude shimmered there, unspoken but unmistakable. She offered him a cup of tea, and though neither said much, their shared silence felt warm, like the space between two lanterns glowing side by side. As evening approached, Mara lit the single string of lights on their old Christmas tree. The lights blinked in uneven patterns, some brighter than others, some flickering as though trying to find the right rhythm. The sight made Theo grin. "It's thinking again," he declared. The warmth of his voice eased something fragile inside Mara. She smoothed his hair gently. "It's doing its best." When the doorbell rang, she assumed a neighbor had come by. But when she opened the door, she froze for a moment in surprise. Adrian stood there holding a second tree. It was smaller than their old one, but it was wrapped in a set of soft, golden lights that glowed like captured sunrise. The tree was bundled neatly at the base, and Adrian stood behind it, looking slightly sheepish, as though uncertain whether it was appropriate to bring a tree into someone else's home. "I thought," he said quietly, "that your tree might appreciate a little help." Theo gasped. "You brought backup!" He rushed forward and touched one of the tiny lights. "Mama, look, it's perfect." Mara felt a soft laugh escape her. She stepped aside, motioning him in. "You didn't have to bring this." "I know," Adrian said, "but it felt right." They set the tree beside the older one. When they plugged in the lights, the room brightened in a way that made everything feel more alive. Theo clapped his hands. "Now it's a little grove," he whispered reverently. The phrase settled gently between the three of them, carrying a meaning deeper than Theo realized. One tree still leaned slightly, tired from many years of being carried from place to place. The other stood straighter, smaller, but glowing with a warmth that felt steady and new. Together, they made the room look like a forest learning how to grow again. Mara brought out cocoa in 3 mismatched mugs. Theo's had a cartoon animal on it. Mara's had a chipped handle. Adrian's was plain white. They sat together near the trees, wrapped in the sort of contented quiet that did not demand conversation. Theo talked about the lantern props he was helping decorate for the show, and Adrian listened with genuine attention. Mara watched them both, her heart warming at how naturally the scene unfolded. Later that week came the night of the showcase. The community center buzzed with soft excitement. Parents and volunteers filled the seats, their coats draped over the backs of chairs. Paper lanterns lined the stage, each one glowing from a small battery-operated light inside. They flickered gently, as though the lanterns themselves were breathing. Mara moved backstage with practiced calm, adjusting halos made of wire and ribbon, smoothing wrinkled costumes, tying shoelaces that kept coming undone. She whispered small encouragements to nervous children, offering them the steadiness she had carried through every difficult season of her own life. Theo stood near the center of the group, holding his lantern with both hands. When he saw Adrian slip quietly into the front row, he straightened a little, his small chest rising with pride. The printed program in Adrian's hands read, "The Boy and the Borrowed Light," written and directed by Mara Ellison, performed by the Lantern Kids. The title alone made something inside him tighten, not painfully, but in recognition. Borrowed light. The phrase seemed to echo everything he had begun to rediscover since the night a child told him he could borrow a mother. When the curtain rose, soft music drifted across the room. The children stepped forward, lanterns glowing like little worlds held carefully in their hands. Their voices came in hesitant waves at first, but as the scenes unfolded, they grew stronger, steadier. The story told of a wandering boy who had lost his inner light, searching through shadows and silence, meeting people who shared small pieces of theirs to guide him forward. Adrian felt the message settle into him like warm breath on frosted glass. Near the end of the play, the stage darkened except for one spotlight that fell upon Theo. He lifted his lantern high enough that it illuminated his face. When he spoke, his voice carried through the room with surprising clarity. "When you are lost in the dark," he said, "you can borrow someone's light until your own shines again." A hush fell over the audience. Some adults blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the weight of those words coming from such a small child. Adrian's breath stilled. He had not realized until that moment how deeply he needed to hear them. The lights rose as the children bowed, lanterns lifted in triumph. Applause filled the room, warm and generous. Adrian found himself clapping not only for Theo, not only for Mara, but for the part of himself that had long forgotten what borrowed light could do. When the curtain closed and the children rushed backstage, Adrian remained seated for a moment longer. His heart felt different, lighter, as though an interior doorway had been opened. He let the warmth linger, knowing it was not a fleeting feeling but the beginning of something he had not dared to name. Backstage, Theo ran into Mara's arms, glowing with pride. She kissed his forehead, whispering that he had been perfect. When they turned, Adrian was already there, offering Theo a quiet nod of admiration and offering Mara a look that held gratitude, respect, and something tender that neither of them moved to put into words. Winter deepened in the days after the showcase, but it did so softly, as though the world had decided to place a gentle hand over the city rather than weighing it down. The snow fell in quieter patterns now, drifting across rooftops and settling into the folds of the streets, like a blanket laid out for someone who had been walking a long time. In the Ellison household, warmth gathered between the small movements of daily life. Theo hummed as he decorated new paper stars for the trees. Mara reheated cocoa in the chipped mug she loved, and Adrian found more reasons than he admitted to stop by, always with something small to bring: fresh bread, new crayons, or simply the kind of presence that made silence comfortable rather than empty. But tonight, Mara had prepared something different. She wrapped a thermos of hot cocoa in a towel, placed 3 mismatched cups into a cloth bag, and told Theo to put on his thickest scarf. When Adrian knocked on the door, she greeted him with a smile that carried intention. "I thought," she said, "that we might visit the park together." Theo's eyes widened. "The park," he echoed, grabbing his mother's hand. "Where you and I met Adrian." Adrian nodded gently. "Yes, where everything started." They stepped into the cold evening. The air was still, the snow crisp beneath their boots. Holiday lights from nearby houses shimmered softly, their reflections catching the edges of the falling snowflakes. The park was quieter now, the trees tall and dark against the night sky, their branches dusted with white. As they walked, Theo swung their joined hands rhythmically, creating a feeling of togetherness that matched the beat of the quiet night. The iron bench came into view, resting beneath the street lamp whose glow had greeted Adrian on the night he thought he had been entirely alone. Snow covered its seat and arms, but its presence remained sturdy, as though it understood the weight of stories placed upon it. Adrian slowed for a moment when he saw it again. The memory of loneliness brushed against him, but it no longer carried the sharpness it once had. Instead, it felt like looking at a photograph of a life he had lived long ago, softened by time and change. Mara brushed away a bit of snow from the bench and laid out the cloth. They all sat down together. She poured cocoa into the 3 cups, the steam rising in warm curls that disappeared into the cold air. Theo cupped his mug with both hands, blowing softly across the surface. Adrian held his gently, feeling the warmth seep through his gloves. "It feels different here now," Mara said quietly. Adrian nodded. "Because I'm not alone this time." She looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "No, none of us are." Theo reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded card. "I made something," he said shyly. "For you." Adrian accepted the card with careful hands. When he opened it, he saw a drawing, simple, made with crayon, but full of so much meaning it took him a moment to breathe. 3 figures sat together on a bench under a sky filled with tiny stars. One figure had a tall shape meant to be him. Beside him was Mara, drawn with a soft curve to her smile. And in the middle was Theo, wearing the striped scarf he loved so much. "It's us," Theo explained earnestly. "The night we met. Mama gave you a cookie and I told you that you could borrow her. And you did." He paused, kicking his legs lightly as they hung over the edge of the bench. "I'm glad you did." The innocence in the boy's voice was so sincere that it opened something within Adrian as easily as breath opens a cold room. He studied the drawing again, tracing a gloved finger lightly over the 3 figures. Even in its simplicity, the picture held a truth he had been afraid to name. A truth that whispered that perhaps this small family had made space for him long before he realized he needed it. Adrian closed the card gently. He looked first at Theo, then at Mara. Snow fell softly around them, the flakes drifting like gentle punctuation to the quiet moment. "Theo," he began, his voice warm but steady. "You were right when you said I could borrow your mom that night." He looked at Mara then, and the sincerity of what he felt showed clearly in his eyes. "But I'm not borrowing anymore." He turned back to Theo and finished, "I'm staying." For a moment, the world paused in a way that felt intentional, as if the snow itself was listening. Mara's breath caught slightly. Theo smiled so wide that his cheeks rounded against his scarf, and something deep inside Adrian settled into a shape that felt like home. Mara leaned gently against his shoulder, the gesture unforced, natural, and full of quiet acceptance. Her voice was soft when she said, "We're glad you're here." Adrian inhaled slowly, taking in the warmth of her closeness, the quiet presence of Theo beside them, and the steady glow of the street lamp above. He felt no urge to speak more. The moment had already said enough. A gentle hush surrounded them. The cocoa steamed in their cups. Snowflakes landed on their coats before melting away. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then silence settled again. The night had the quality of a story ending not with grandeur, but with a promise kept. Theo tugged lightly at Adrian's sleeve. "Do you think," he asked, "that the bench remembers us?" Adrian smiled, his voice soft as winter breath. "I think benches remember everyone who waits on them, but this one remembers us the most." Theo nodded in full agreement, completely satisfied with the idea. They sat there for a long time, sharing warmth and cocoa, letting the quiet of the night wrap around them. And though none of them said it aloud, they all understood that this bench, once a witness to loneliness, had become a witness to something much gentler. Something that looked very much like a family forming its earliest roots. Eventually, Mara stood, brushing snow from her coat. Theo hopped down eagerly, and Adrian followed close behind. As they walked away, their footsteps pressed a new pattern into the snow, 3 sets of tracks moving in the same direction.